Dear all, welcome to our show this Sunday. It's a privilege this Sunday to have a guest from United States that we're going to discuss about Iran, but we'll discuss about Iran about some very interesting topics about is going on currently in Vienna. Also, we're going to discuss about the development of clerical leadership, discussing about the sanctions in Iran, about the political situation, and we're going to discuss also about something very important that personally I have a big interest, and a lot of people do, about the women in Iran-Iraq war in 1980s and 1988. And we're going to receive tremendous information because Matteo, that he's with us, he wrote a book about it. It's a book that we saw it and it's been published recently and has reviews, amazing reviews actually. Matteo, we are welcome you to our show this Sunday. We're very happy to have you from the United States. And as we said before the show starts, we have received 80 questions about you from our friends that they're waiting to learn a lot of things about Iran. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Matteo, you are professor, sorry, in Illinois, and actually you are involved in Mossadegh scholarship. Can you explain us also what is the Mossadegh scholarship?
So, Northeastern Illinois University has the only academic space in the world that's named after Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran in the 1950s. And we have a hall named after him, the Mossadegh Servant Leaders Hall at the College of Business and Technology. And we also have several scholarships also that are part of an endowment. So we have it at the College of Arts and Sciences, and we also have it at the College of Business and Technology. And we have an annual lecture every year in April, named after the late Premier.
So Matteo, I think that you are the one that is following the developments in Iran. What shall we expect after the Vienna talks at the moment? We are discussing about the nuclear agreement that the United States unilaterally withdrew in 2018 during the administration of Trump. So now United States, they are back to the table with Iran, and some sanctions already are lifted. How do you consider this, and what kind of developments shall we expect about it?
Well, I guess everybody's eyes are on Ukraine and Russia, what's been happening there with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But at the same time, too, there's a lot of developments going on inside Iran and between the P5+1 and Iran trying to revive the JCPOA, or the nuclear agreement that, as you said, was United States withdrew from in 2018. From all the news that we're all hearing the same, I'm not hearing it from any other place other than you are. It appears that way, and the Iranian media is also covering this, that they are getting very close to an agreement. However, there is a new challenge that has come about by Russia, since in the last statement by Foreign Secretary Lavrov, he had mentioned that they would not sign off on the new JCPOA, regardless of everybody's wants or wishes to get this going, because the United States has launched unprecedented sanctions against Iran, against Russia, for its actions in Ukraine. Hence, it wants a written guarantee that those sanctions would not involve Russian business ties with Iran, with the Islamic Republic, and that could actually uh, sort out the effort, destroy the efforts that have been made. So that leaves the JCPOA up in the air at the moment.
So, Matteo, even if we have seen some sanctions to be lifted, this is not something positive that will lead the Islamic Republic to feel comfortable and continue the negotiations.
It's not up to the Islamic Republic to feel comfortable. It's up to one of the members of P5+1, one of the Security Council members, Russia, that if it doesn't want this to move forward because of its own interests, it's not going to move forward. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not privy to what goes on, in the, behind the scenes. But rationally speaking, logically speaking, if Russia doesn't sign on to the newly negotiated deal in Vienna, I don't see how this would go forward.
But so, how this implication happen? Certainly, we see the conflict in Ukraine. A lot of people they speak about nuclear war. I mean, from my perspective, I don't see any nuclear war at all. And certainly, the time that the negotiations in Vienna they used to take one way and move forward, we see Russia appearing in the perspective from actually from not far away, and this is very strange. Is it a kind of initiation by West? The time that Russia is going to find a solution in Ukraine with any solution with with the Ukrainians, to take Iran out and press Iran to move away from the agreement with China.
Well, China, I don't know whether or not this is true, but as of a few hours ago, I checked, China is also asking for the same thing, for some sort of written guarantee that the United States has to give China for its business dealings with Iran. I don't know how much of that is true, so I don't want to start propagating fake information. I haven't seen that from many news outlets, but if that's the case, then it's going to be harder for Iran to really get the JCPOA and hopefully get the sanctions that it wants removed, for the lack of a better term, not so much for politics, but for the real people on the ground that are being hurt because of those sanctions.
Mathieu, do you feel that the United States they don't trust the Islamic Republic? There is a kind of mistrust on the political way, because we have seen that Biden was very aggressive on Islamic Republic, and I think that most of the times he was very unfair about it, and he didn't justify this aggression.
Well, you have to remember also that when the '79 revolution happened on February 11th, 1979, a few months later in November, the Iranian students stormed the American embassy, and the issue of mistrust from one perspective starts there. So, United States, yes, does not trust the Islamic Republic at all, and Iran the same way. Then you can take this back and say the mistrust actually was created by the overthrowing of the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, when the CIA and the MI6, in concert, they united against the Iranian people and overthrew his government. So this mistrust goes back, over 50, 60 years since 53. And if it takes that long for mistrust to build, it's going to take a lot longer for trust to be brought back in. So it's going to take time. I think both sides are very aware of each other. They don't trust each other, but you have to start somewhere if you want to create a meaningful relationship, meaningful dialogue between the two.
So, Matteo, you took us very well to 1979, and we had the revolution. I mean, it started in February, 79. Already on the 16th of January, the last Shah flew Iran. So he was not in Iran. On the 1st of February, Khomeini is coming back to Iran after 16 years in exile from France, and we have the revolution. So this revolution, though, a lot of people they saw, an analyst and presidents, even Carter said I was misled by the information I was receiving by the counselors and the advisors of Shah about what's going on in Iran. Even he said that I was receiving false information by my own people and the American embassy in Iran and the intelligence services. The Red Revolution didn't happen. There was no communist revolution, but it was an Islamic revolution. And Khomeini was there. The people welcomed Khomeini. The Islamic revolution was not terminated. It's still there, despite what a lot of people used to believe. So 79, the Islamic Revolution starts. On 22nd of September, Saddam is invading Iran.
The
And
following year.
exactly,
Mhm.
on the 80s. So it's we have a book that you wrote, and I mean, we have also, I mean, seen a lot of incidents that they've been described there, and you are mentioning to the role of the women in the Iran-Iraq war. What was the role of the women there? It was passive. They used to be active there. They used to be in the army. How the women they understood the war between Iran, Iraq, and Iran.
So, as many people in the West or outside Iran think of Muslim women in general, and in particular Iranian Muslim women specific, they are always thinking of those women as on the receiving end of all things violent, that they're being there's a lot of injustice against them, and uh, to a certain extent that is true. There's no denying that. But at the same time, they are not the weak beings that people might think they are. In the book, I demonstrate how the Iranian women are actually the exact opposite of what everybody thinks. They are very brave, they're very driven. There is an agency that they like to put themselves at the center of socio-political affairs, not any different than those women in various democracies around the world. They're no different than women in India or in Cyprus or in Greece or in the UK or France. Their circumstances are different, but to say that they are weak and they cannot participate or the men don't let them participate, this book actually goes counter to that, and it proves, based on the reviews that are coming out on the book, it proves that actually that wasn't the case, and I discuss in detail various things that actually women do. I talk about 17, 18 different roles that women play in, with the most basic being the stereotypical things that we know of women, doing domestic things or cooking. That means cooking for the front lines for the soldiers, but the most complicated would be flying reconnaissance missions on planes or doing surgeries in the battlefield, caring for the patients, acting.
Mateo, do we have information how many women they participated that time in the war? Are there any statistics?
Well, we don't have statistics as to how many women participate in the battle because that those figures have never been gathered. Because as you remember, if people remember the Iranian-Iraq border, there are a lot of cities very close to the Iran-Iraq border, a lot of small towns close to the border. So when the invasion took place, similar to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, the people that are immediately affected by the war are the people that live close to the border. So obviously, the women that lived in those small towns, these are very poor towns, poor areas, not very well developed. They're not even now, let alone 40 years ago or 40 some odd years ago when the war started. So we don't have an exact number of those women. But in my book, I argue that just as many number of men that participated in the war, there is at least one, two, three, four, five women that actually fought either alongside women or behind the scenes, but they never get the credit for being the fighters. Because in everybody's mind, a fighter is a person who carries a gun, who is involved in combat, although Iranian women did that. But my argument is that we need to look at war and war participation from a radical different perspective, and that is by looking at women that actually are part of the war through the participation of their loved ones who happen to be male.
So, Matteo, to help us also our friends to understand, because they're sending questions all the time. Um, we had the war that started in September 1980s. How this war started, and step by step, how did the women realize? Because there were women, of course, that they had to defend their house, their kids. Also, there were women that they lost kids. I mean, I remember when I've been in Iran, I have seen some statistics that there are even mothers that they lost eight sons.
Mhm.
So, that was very a big tragedy for these families as well, because at that time there was no law to say that you have five sons, only the four or the three they go to war. It was very critical for them to participate, because that time it was the time of the sanctions after the Islamic Revolution, and Iran couldn't have also any armament or any supplies. So whatever it was doing, it was on the self-sufficiency economy, as Khomeini also used to describe it as well that time. So I mean, we come in September in on the 22nd. We have the message that and we have the war. How do the women they react?
So your first question was, how did the war start, or how did the women react?
How the women react?
Well, the women reacted by taking up arms and by staying behind.
Okay. So there were so the women they could go to a campus and say, I want to fight, give me a gun.
Yeah, I mean, in the towns that were closer to the border, mainly in Khorramshahr and Abadan, because Khorramshahr fought from being invaded in light of the fact that the Iraqi divisions, there were two divisions, one division first and then another division joined, which is a lot of people trying to take down a city that had a population of 100,000 plus. So from that aspect, the people evacuated the city. An overwhelming number of women actually stayed with men, and they held up the city from falling into the Iraqi hands for 34 days till in October of 1980. So again, your audience must remember also that, as you mentioned, Iran was in a very dire situation in the war, very difficult. It had just come about from a very cataclysmic, politically cataclysmic event, which was the revolution. It had become an Islamic republic, a theocratic state. The top-notch military leaders that had been trained in the West, mostly in the United States, they had been executed, so there had been a military purge. And the people that were left to run the imperial army, that was now the army of the Islamic Republic, they were not well suited to fight a full-on conventional war with a very advanced army like Iraq's army. And
Um, just Matteo, as an explanation, how come in the women they go to they say we go to the war? For example, here in Cyprus, when we had the Turkish invasion in 1974, most of the women they didn't go to the war. I mean, they stayed back with the kids or they left for the battles. So it's very extraordinary how this culturally works. Um,
well, it culturally works because of two things. Number one, during the monarchy, before the revolution, not the entire Iranian female population participated in the reform movement that was brought in a secular sense. So the women that were conservative, wearing hijab during the monarchy, when the hijab was not mandatory, they still wore it. The women that actually went to Quran classes rather than to secular regular classes, that was the majority of the population. And what happened after the revolution, those women were emboldened by the belief that they could participate because they lived in an Islamic society now. So that's why
well, the ideology was a strong feeling in order to fight for.
well, I'm not even talking about that right now. The ideology comes second. The most important thing is that these women actually feel comfortable participating in something that otherwise, if the revolution hadn't happened, they wouldn't have participated more than likely. So that we have to understand that there is a sense of secular versus national feminist movement, and in Iran we haven't had a religious feminist movement till now, till after the revolution. Before that, that Islamic feminist movement really doesn't happen. It's all secular, so it's shrouded in a Western concept of feminism. It doesn't take into effect a woman that might wear a hijab, that she has the same amount of rights, or she should be allowed to participate in many things and not be required to remove the hijab, so to speak. See what I'm saying? And in the book, I talk about that. In the second chapter or the first chapter of the book, I talk about history of feminism and women's movement in Iran, and why these women, going back to your question, why these women actually did participate, because they felt comfortable. and their fathers, their sons, their husbands allowed them to do it because there was this milieu or this Islamic atmosphere that everybody trusted.
So Matteo, that was at the beginning of the war. How women participated these 8 years? Are there some examples of women participating? I mean, of course, there were good surgeries, especially the women that they were doctors or nurses. I mean, I have seen stories in Iran that there were women that they were teachers and taking care of orphans in many times. I have seen women that they make their house a kind of campus cooking for all the village. So they used to, or for example, some women that they used to go taking the gun by the soldiers in order for them to sleep and take some rest because due to the war. So when this war is proceeding and it doesn't finish in 1 year but takes 8 years, what is the feeling among the women that they have to follow what is going on, they have to participate? Did they feel, because also it's not to participate, but I mean, when you are losing a son or a husband, especially a child, for a woman is very difficult.
Mhm.
How did they feel in these 8 years?
So the women don't participate in combat throughout the 8 years completely. After Khorramshahr is liberated in 1982, pretty much the war's dynamics kind of change, and it becomes a war of attrition, we call it, right? Little by little, people know that this fighting is not going to go anywhere. So the women who participate will do so in official positions. So they remain as doctors, as nurses, as first responders, as photographers, as journalists, as newsmakers, as maybe drivers, as people that worked on the train that was kind of a moving hospital from the south going to the north and to other cities carrying the injured. But the overwhelming majority of women's participation takes place when they still are okay with the participation of their man and taking the responsibility of their household while the men are gone, and they keep participating when their men are being captured as POWs, prisoners of war, and they have to take care of the family. So some of them go back to school, some of them take up jobs, some of them have to move around in order to make a living, in order till the time that their husbands come back. And when their husbands come back, the war continues. There is nobody being shot, no bombs, because a lot of these men, when they come back, they have mental stress disorder. There's a lot of psychological disorders, a lot of challenges that takes place. There's a lot of physiological changes that has happened in these men. Some of them cannot reproduce children. That leads to more mental anguish and divorces and separations. So women are constantly involved in this challenging situation that they see themselves in. And what I argue in the book also is that that war has not stopped for the women that have kept going. Actually, it's interesting when I watch the Ukraine stuff, people are talking about the end of the hostilities and, hopefully ceasefire. And I hope for that too, obviously, for the obvious reason. But at the same time, once war starts, the wars never end. They take a different shape because people's livelihoods are going to change. The reason why I'm sitting here right now in Chicago and I'm not in Iran, in my hometown, is because of the war. And that's also the situation for millions of other Iranians, millions that were displaced either internally inside Iran or people that were displaced and they migrated to other cities, maybe to Cyprus, maybe to Greece, to Europe, to the United States by majority and other places. So going back to your question, the combat phase of the war for women's involvement kind of ends in 1982, and women start entering the security forces and the law enforcement, police agencies, and security apparatus of the Revolutionary Guards is going to have a sizable women division that still has today. That's in charge of many, many things. Some of them we know about, some of them we don't know anything because they're secrets.
Until when the people that came back, the men that came back from the battles, you said that when they had to face a lot of issues about their physiological and pathological and also psychological situation. There were some also references that we have seen gases that've been sent. Uh, I mean, gas war during the.
Chemical weapons, you mean?
Yes, exactly. Yes. So a lot of people they came back to their families, but of course they never until today they have some disabilities or mentally they are not well. How did the security? How did the society provide any security and any assistance to these people? I'm not talking about the state. I'm talking about the society on the part of solidarity.
Well, we should talk about the chemical war agents that were used by Saddam Hussein indiscriminately against not only the Iranian military but also the Iranian civilians. And they were used on villages and towns very freely. And the end result of that is a generation of women that were influenced, that were affected by these chemical war agents, so they cannot have children. And because of a variety of reasons. They cannot have jobs because they have respiratory issues and what have you. The state, you said we're not going to talk about the state and how the state is treating them. The society in general looks by suspicion, some aspect of the society looks by suspicion anyone that has been part of the war because they see the war as an extension of the Islamic Republic, or if you went to war, you absolutely agreed with what the Islamic Republic wanted or wants now. And that couldn't be more unfair than that. I think that's a very unfair thinking that is done by a lot of Iranians, but it is very prevalent. The children of the martyred do have a complex themselves. The women of the martyrs are having a hard time actually doing things in the society because there is a misconception about them that they are part of the Islamic Republic apparatus. Hence, they're being helped in a variety of ways, and that's not true at all. A lot of these people are still poor. They do not participate in anything that is political or economic to the sense that they would make oligarchs out of them. We do have our Iranian oligarchs, obviously, just like Russia does. But in that aspect, not the entire, over 1 million people participated in the war. And not all of those people made it to become businessmen or business owners or anything like that. A lot of them went back to their previous jobs with the label on their chest that they actually participated. So they're not liked within the society and they're not liked within the government because they are seen as a nuisance because you have to help them out. And the government usually doesn't do that.
Because when I've been in Iran, I have seen a lot of monuments and a lot of posters about the martyrs. Martyrdom is something very special in Iranian culture and, of course, in the religion. So I have seen a lot of people praising the martyrs in cemeteries, but also in monuments. There is this kind of martyr culture. Um, so something that I was quite impressed that I saw in Iran is that, of course, the martyrs they were not only Muslims, Shia or Sunni, they were also Armenians or, in some other cases, Zoroastrians
And Jewish
uh,
too.
and Jewish Jews too,
Jewish and
exactly.
Baha'is, yeah.
Exactly. So I was very impressed as an Orthodox when I have seen it was 1 year ago that they found the bodies of 4 or 5 Armenians. So the Iranian army officials and the Iranian politicians they went to the funerals. They've been praised just like all other Iranians, and there was no discrimination. And, for a lot of people that they receive this kind of propaganda about the minorities in Iran. It's also, I believe, quite shocking. I mean, for me as a researcher of Iran, I was expecting because I could see how Iran works, I could understand the culture. But what was the role of the women of minorities in this war?
The women and minorities, there is not much information out there of, let's say, because there was a sizable population of Armenians that lived in the southwest where the invasion took place. And it wasn't part of my research to find out exactly what women did. But again, by saying participation, I think the public could be doing itself a favor when it thinks about participation, not in the sense of who's going to carry a gun or drop a bomb somewhere, but actually the notion of losing one's son or one's husband. I think that's the ultimate sign of participation in a war, right? And I think on a global scale, people need to think about wars in that way, not in the way of who's going to pick up a gun and kill somebody or defend the country, whatever they want to call it. I think the Jewish woman, the Baha'i woman, the Sunni woman, the Armenian woman, the Assyrian woman, the Chaldeans, all these people did participate by losing somebody in the war. And I'm sure within their bodies there are professionals, nurses, medical doctors, surgeons that actually participate as well. But that wasn't part of my research, so I can't give an exact number.
So, as of today, Matteo, what is the feeling? Because the Islamic Republic is one of the states in the world that they have, I think, almost half of the population is young population, and was born after the Islamic Revolution. And I think this is, I mean, from the democratic perspective, it's very fascinating. So those women that they lived the war back then, now they are mothers and grandmothers, they have kids. How do the younger women that they didn't live or they were born during the war do understand what happened back then?
They don't. There is a dissonance. There's a disconnection of these various generations, the young generations with the war. Again, because that's partly because of how the Islamic Republic has taken ownership of the war narrative, we should call it. And because they keep calling it our war, it has pushed the public away that didn't necessarily participate but could have been sympathetic to the cause. See what I'm saying? And by doing that, the new generation doesn't like to talk about it unless there is a threat against Iran. Then Iranian nationalism or patriotism kind of pops up, right? So I've been monitoring the social media since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and people are talking, oh, good for the Ukrainians to defend themselves and what have you, but they have no reference that actually Iranians did exactly the same thing 42 years ago under very, very different and very difficult conditions too. And they did phenomenal as far as military performance is concerned, given the fact that they were not getting any satellite information, any arms from anywhere. I mean, with Ukraine, is getting flooded with.
Until this kind of the imposed war, that how this is called, the war with Iran Iraq. I mean, why does the Islamic Republic is calling this an imposed war?
Because it was because it was an imposed war. Iran had not participated in any international conflicts, if you want to call it, or interregional conflict for about close to 200 years before that. The last time that a Persian or an Iranian, whatever you want to call them, Nader Shah actually invaded and looted many things from India was actually in the 1700s, right? Before the creation of the Qajar dynasty. So Iran had not provoked anybody and had not wanted to expand on anyone even after the Islamic Revolution had happened. One problem was, however, that Ayatollah Khomeini kept talking about the exporting of the revolution to all other places, especially Muslim places that were run by puppet regimes of the West, or puppet regimes that were very secular and they were not sensitive to the needs of their own people. And he called on Saudi Arabian citizens to rise against the House of Saud. He talked about the Kuwaitis to do the same, to rise against the House of Al Sabah family. He did the same thing with Iraq to rise against the Ba'athis. He did the same thing for Egypt. So from some perspective, you could argue that that was sort of a poking the bear, as we call it in the United States. You know, he went a bit too far, but at the same time, there was nothing physical. Nobody had moved any group or any
Matteo, what was
hold on, or nobody had done any of that stuff. And the reason why Saddam Hussein saw the time opportune to invade was very, very simple. Iran had engaged in something on an international level, which was taking hostages of the United States. So it had made itself secluded, it had isolated himself by that behavior, right? And the second thing, Iran, it appeared, or they made it appear like it was going to pick a fight with everybody around it. And third, the Arab nationalism had taken a beating because of its losses a decade earlier in 1967 in the Arab-Israeli conflict, when the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai fell into the hands of the Israelis and defeated the Arabs. So I think all of those in combination created an environment that Saddam Hussein thought is very, very perfect to invade, occupy, and keep, and hopefully, drive to Tehran and take down the regime. So from that aspect, uh, um, I think you could look at it from both perspectives. One, Iran really didn't provoke anybody, but from another aspect, you could say, well, they felt threatened, but the response was not a reasonable response by the side of Saddam Hussein.
So, Matteo, taken out of the Islamic Revolution in 79, I think something very important is to understand how if clerical leadership influences Iran, and what are the roots of this clerical leadership? Because I'm Greek. We had some common past, and when I've been in Iran, it was one of the ways to go to Persepolis. So immediately all the friends, they feel very proud. Not very proud because Alexander was there, but it was a kind lot of friends. They said to me, wow, whatever we read in the books, we see it now in Iran. So Persepolis exists. I mean, we see the same statues. It's amazing. They start studying about Darius. Suddenly, a lot of people, they are looking information about the Persian Empire. So I remember when I post the panorama of Persepolis, it was a very nice video. A lot of people, they feel very proud, not because of Alexander only, but also because it's a proud nation. So now we talk about the Persian Empire. At that time, it was quite viral in the social media in Greece and Cyprus, this kind of video, because a lot of people, they start talking about Iran and what's going suddenly in Iran. So yeah, for me, I think that from all the trips I've done around, I think that it was a kind of a pilgrim trip history. It was a modus of history, and I think that I have accomplished all my wishes. Let's say, being in Persepolis, but also being in Persepolis for me, it was very crucial because I've been to Susa. I've been to so many other areas, and for example, Necropolis that is nearby, and understanding the Persian culture that now is Iran. It's something that is very unique, we could say. I mean, I don't find any other country that is similar to Iran. Iran, it has very nature, and I mean, even how the people, they think, how they understand the level of nation, and even how the nation became a state. And there are so many ethnicities in Iran, but people, they love Iran and they have the same statehood. I would say that, and then I will come to the question just for the people also to understand. I remember when I was in Shiraz, so we met a guy that he was almost 21. So I asked him, "Where do you come from?" He said that we live in the desert. We're kind of moving here and there, but he had a Turkmen origin. So that time I said to him, "Do you feel Turkish or Iranian?" He said to me, "I feel Turkish." And I said to him, if there was a war between Turkey and Iran, and he said, "I will fight for my country. I'm Iranian." So at that time, you understand the passion and the love for the country, though there are so many ethnicities. So, Matteo, going back, part of our history is part of your history. So we study a lot about the Persian nature and about the Persian culture and history. I remember, I think it was Darius that he said, "I was appointed by God to lead the nation until to accomplish His wills."
Mhm.
So even that time, I mean, the kings, they believe that they have to comply with the divine laws. They didn't have only the men laws, but they had to comply with the divine laws, and that was very important for them in order to have the kingship, but of course the people to accept them. And it, I mean, they were accepted because they were coming by a king's family, or because they were brave, like in the case of Cyrus. So, how come in Iran it has not such a passion, but the Islamic Republic was accepted by a big percentage of the people? Even at the Constitutional Revolution back in 1905, we see that the people in the Constitution, they wanted God to prevail the king. And also the White Revolution of 1963 of Mohammad Reza Shah was not successful because he tried to touch very much the Islamic foundations, and also to make such secularistic reforms in order to transform Iran from what it is to most westernized society. I mean, from where this kind of cleric leadership comes from?
So let me say something before I answer that question of where does the clerical leadership, the idea comes from. Yes, we do know about Alexander coming to Persepolis. We also know that after he burns down Persepolis, he gets very saddened, and he actually marries Darius's daughter, and he starts wearing the Persian garb. I don't know if your audience knows that. And he actually becomes Persianized to a certain extent. I don't
Well,
know.
actually, this is what Shahnameh says and Ferdowsi. But what we know is that that he was married to four women. Three of them, they were Persian,
Yeah,
and actually the successor, Alexander the Fourth,
right,
his son was about to be half Persian by Roxana.
right.
So I mean, the successor of Alexander was about to be half Persian. So I think that he didn't have anything against Persia, and it was, let's say, a kind of command by Aristotle, his teacher, that said to him, "You have to respect Persians because, according to a previous legend, the Spartans and the Persians, they have the same ancestors."
Oh, wow.
So
Well,
it's a whole mythology behind it.
and it's interesting that you mentioned the four wives. I don't know, maybe he was a secret Muslim before it was.
I think we know the fourth. I'm sure there were some more, but at least we know who was about to be the successor.
Interesting. So, going back to the original question, where does clerical leadership come from? So, for those of people in your audience that might not know, uh, in general, when Islam was created in 622, what happened? The political Islam evolved over time as Islam moved out of Arabia, and the Persians had a great influence in how to manipulate and how to construct a new political system based on an Islamic understanding of what rule is and what the rule of law should be and how should the government, act in general. And that takes a few hundred years. And during the Abbasid dynasty, from 750 all the way to the 1250s, before the Mongols come, Persians become very, very influential in standardizing many, many things that the Islamic Caliphate will use in order to become very prosperous and expand widely everywhere throughout North Africa.
Yes, especially Abbasids, they use also, for example, the transportation and the
Right.
administration of Persian Empire in north
Right.
there. And actually, there is, I think, it goes from Fry, if I
Mhm.
remember well, a kind of argument that I mean, the Abbasids going to east, actually they Persianized the caliphate instead of
Right.
To
Right.
Arabize it.
Right, right. So there is a little bit of Greek and Persian mixing of various institutions in Islamic Caliphate. And that happens when the Umayyads set up in Damascus and they Greekify the Islamic political system. But that's short-lived for about 90 years, then it moves to Baghdad, and Baghdad is built, and that's all history now. But what happens is during the Abbasid dynasty, the Iranians do their best to construct a new identity for Persians that would particularly serve their purposes. And one of the things they did was this institutionalization of a lot of things that later on will be worked into the Shiite sort of political ideology that you have right now in Iran. It's alive and well, and it's in action, and it actually works, right? It's been proven that it actually works since 1979. What happens in year 1501? Persia effectively adopts Shiism as a sect that was, and it becomes a minority sect in Islam, which
Matteo, I would like to ask, at that time, Ismail the first, he officialized what the people used to believe.
Mhm.
I would like to ask, the Shia belief it was, the major part of the population at that time.
Well, no, they were the minority. And there was the way Iran became Shiite was actually through a lot of violence. There was a lot of force by Ismail and by his successors, and it took a few years, actually, a couple of decades, if I'm not mistaken, for Iran to become fully Shiite. And even then, you're going to have 200 years later, in the war that I just mentioned by Nader Shah, there is going to be a drive to make Iran Sunni again, but it's not going to work. Iran will remain a Shiite state. So in 1500s, when Iran becomes a Shiite state, there are four important elements that create the Iranian identity, and that remains to be the case. Number one, Iran, because it preserves its language, Persian or Farsi, it keeps an identity that is not going to be influenced by anybody else. So it creates a very, very specific identity through language. That's number one. Number two, it will create Shiism as its national state religion, which basically means the Ottomans cannot influence it and the Mughals of India cannot influence it. So that's number two. It becomes an identity factor to be Shiite and to be Persian. Number three, they will keep all the imperial institutions that they had been accustomed to going back to the time of the Greeks and Persians. So we are thinking that they, as a part of the political DNA of Persians, they keep this institution of kingship and mix it with the idea of being Muslim or Islamic in a Shiite context. It's a bit complex, but the imperial practices will remain. That's why the Shah still is going to be deemed as the shadow of God on earth, or a not a representative, but somebody that would be second to
I
God.
think I think Ismail was claimed that he was coming by the
At the beginning, he did. Yeah, at the beginning,
he
he
was
did.
claiming
He said he's the Messiah, right? And then when he died, the idea of Messiah dies because the Messiah doesn't die, right? The whole purpose of having a Messiah is for the end of time to come, and that would be the end of the world. In essence, you move into a different shift.
because it was in the 78 as well that it was the massacre in Tehran by Mohammed Reza Shah. That after, I think it was in September 78. After a few weeks, he was on the video. He said, "I know that that what happened is wrong. I will take the justice." And he says, I will protect the monarchy because the monarchy is coming by the God and it's been
Yeah.
appointed." It was
So,
something so.
so it's an old Persian sort of way of thinking when it comes to politics, and it's not only Persians that do that. Actually, this happens in the United Kingdom too. The role that the queens and kings have, as in the absence of having God preside or having some entity that would be really just, the next best thing would be to have a king that would be sort of like the father or the mother of the society to keep everybody safe in that sense. And the fourth thing that Iran is going to have that's going to lead to its identity and to its solidification as a culture, it's its borders. For the great majority of people in the world, they do not know that the only country in the Middle East that has had the same border for over 500 years, give or take, is Iran. And in Europe, the only country that has had the same situation based on these understandings of identity would be Spain and Portugal. So from that aspect, these three countries would be the oldest that pretty much more or less have had the same identity, not only based on a physical feature of the borders, but also language and religion, both being Catholic, Iran being Shiite, both having borders the same way, and Iran doing the same thing, and the institution of monarchy that still is very, very important in all the countries. So it's from there in the 1500s that actually this idea of kingship takes place, but the king itself himself, he cannot be answerable to everything. He does need a religious component that in essence would legitimize him, and that legitimization will only come if the clerical leadership will put a stamp of approval on this case. And that's where the role of Sheikh al-Islam comes, the highest religious
And the Ayatollah as well.
not yet. We don't have an Ayatollah yet. The Ayatollah will be
It's
invented
later.
later on. Yes.
It's later.
Ayatollah would be invented later on in 18th century, and in 19th century it becomes a absolute religious power in the hands of a jurist or an Ayatollah that can actually. These people are in God business, so anything that God wants, they know what God wants. They know how to please God, and they know how to displease God. So they tell the people, if you have any issues on a religious sense, then we can help you because we know what God wants. Not that because there are connections between them and God. They don't have that connection, but they are in essence the deputy, they call themselves, the deputy of the Shiite Messiah or the 12th Imam in the case of Iranians. So for Mahdi, who has been in occultation and who has been in hiding since year 945 or whatever it was, they are the only party that can actually tell people how God is pleased or not pleased with their actions. So what happens during the Shah's time? The Shah, because he wants to become a reformer in a Western sense and speed up the process of modernity, he sees religion as an obstacle that should be.
Matteo, and just you know, from at least from my research about the last Shah, I mean, it says that he was religious. He tried to have a very good relation with the clerics. Of course, when he received the power in 41, he was
42.
41, 42. He was only 21 years old. He came from a boarding school in Switzerland, so actually he didn't have any political experience.
Mhm.
But he tried. He was believer. I remember I have seen some of his speeches by the end of 70s, yes, before he leaves, that he was making a kind of statements, and it was it was the Quran and some photos or pictures of Imam Hussein. So
Mhm.
he tried to be religious in this kind of essence, and I strongly believe that even by the end, he used to believe that the Red Revolution is going to happen. The Russian, I mean, pro-Russian revolution instead of an Islamic. I think he didn't really understand the influence of Islam
Well, it's
in the society.
it's one thing to become religious and become devout and be a believer. It's another one to be impractical about your politics.
Of
You know,
course, yeah, exactly.
sometimes people confuse superstition with religion too, right? And if you allow that to happen, then you're going to confuse a lot of things, and then you're going to think, okay, just because I'm religious, just because I dream of Imam Hussein or I see something in the Quran, then people won't rise against me. That's kind of a silly notion, I think, that the Shah had, that because he was religion, he would be protected by God and he would be protected by Islam in that regard. Definitely, he was a believer to a certain extent. I don't know if he prayed or if he was devout to the fact that he would fast or anything like that, but he did make the pilgrimage to Mecca. He did visit the holy Shiite sites and all
Actually,
that.
you know, I met his biographer, and the biographer said he said that publicly many times that even when he was a teenager, he had a kind of a disease. So when he
Yeah,
got well, he believed that he was saved by the God to have a mission. Or when he was shot, he was alive because of bhakti or
right.
some other prestigious and projections that he had. So, Matteo, there is a question that we had the Qajar, and on the 20s, we had the Constitutional Revolution in 1905. Oh, where there by law the sense of God exists. So whatever happens in Iran, the king needs to be in compliance with the divine laws. And then we had Reza Shah that is coming in 25, 26, 1925, 26. So he tries to change the nature of Iran. He goes. I think in a more aggressive way. He wants to stop women or to wear hijabs. He was taking the leadership from the clerics. Well, I mean, why someone like Reza Shah he wants to do this kind of developments in a period where the Turkey, I mean, we have Kemal Atatürk in Turkey that he's doing more or less the same things, but Turkish nation is not completed. It doesn't have the long history of Iranian nation. So until to become successful, he pays a lot of pain, and Turkish people as well. Why I mean Reza Shah is taking the power and he tries to create a more secularistic Iran so early in the 90s.
Well, the answer to that is very simple. All of the Middle East thought that if they wanted to reform, they had to become secular because they saw modernity as part of or on an equal footing to secularization was put into equal footing to modernity. If you wanted to be advanced, you needed to be secular. And that was the misunderstanding or the confusion that even today in the Middle East exists. The idea that if you want to become reformed and if you wanted to become modern, you have to act like Westerners in a social or in a cultural manner, and that's just a crazy notion. I think it's because it's misunderstood. I think Reza Shah misunderstood it, and to a certain extent, I think Ataturk misunderstood it too, because with the behavior of Ataturk, or what happens with the separation that takes place, especially with like the Greek population trying to purify this republic that is named after the Turks, after an ethnic group of people. Uh, 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 it didn't lead very well, and you see where Turkey is going with all of this. It's sort of like a full circle going back again to the idea of Islamic identity, and I think that's what happened in Iran. Iran went through a cycle of modernity through secularization, and the overwhelming majority that was not accepting of that, they refused, and that's how you have the revolution. That's how somebody who's 80 plus years old, who has I don't know, onions and mustard, onions and yogurt for dinner, and lives a very simple life, he could come and convince the great majority of the population that they should overthrow their government for something better. And he wasn't talking about so much what he wanted. Everything became apparent afterwards, after he lands in Iran, and things become more obvious then what he was thinking. So why Reza Shah did that? For the same reason that Ataturk did, for the same reason that other leaders did. They saw something inherently natural in the process of modernization, which went only through the corridor of westernization, and that was the mistake.
Did he have any support on that, or it was in his desire to
No,
become a Western leader?
no, he did have supporters. I mean, Iran at that time, I talk about this in my first book. At the turn of the 20th century, 1900, the total population of Iran, out of whatever it was, 7 million, 10 million, 5 million, we don't have an exact number. Whatever the population was, only about 2% of it or less could read and write. And 98% were under the spell of clerical leadership. And that was the idea of being influenced by what Islam is and what God wants. What I told you, these people are in business of God. They know what God wants. They speak God's language, so they can tell people, pay your religious taxes. And it's sort of like what in Christianity they went through when the church was in charge of how to make God happy or unhappy. If people paid for their indulgences, then of course, God would forgive them, but if they wouldn't, they would go to hell. Sort of like the same situation we had in Iran at that time. Even now, I think there is a big size population in Iran that's still a believer of that. Whether or not this belief today has the same political potency, that leaves the room for a lot of discussion. I don't know about that, but I think Iran remains still very concerned about its conservativeness. It's about its Islamic identity, but it wants to move forward. So this is probably a historical moment.
Matteo,
Yeah.
there were some references that actually I mean, in 36, he changed the name from Persia to Iran.
Uh-huh.
So he sent a telegraph to all the embassies in the country, calling the country as Iran and not as Persia. There are a lot of scholars also claiming that he had a kind of a different understanding of Aryanism. So that time he and they say that even Iranians were feeling. I mean, the intellectual Iranians, or those that they were very close to Shah, they used to feel quite unlucky because they were in a region that around them they were not other Aryans, and they used to feel this kind of, let's say, loneliness, ideology, and origin loneliness. Um, I mean, is that true to the perspective that they created? This is the first question, and the
Oh yeah.
second one.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. The idea of Iran does come about in the process of Iranian national, the development of Iranian nationalism through scholarship. So all those people today who are talking about Iranian ancient history, they try to contextualize that identity through exactly what Reza Shah was told at the moment, because he wasn't a very educated person to begin with. So he did have help from the educated Iranians that had either been trained in Iran or
There was an academy at the University of Tehran, I think,
right,
that time
right.
he
And that's when it
created
was,
that.
that's when the university was actually established, and it became a center for creating this Iranian identity that all Iranians enjoy today. This idea of, you know, being Iranian means that you're actually Persian, and that takes you or connects you
Matteo,
to
if I'm not mistaken, if we take Shahnameh, that is the most not ancient, but at least it's one of the good resources of Iranian history. I think they never mention the term Persia does not refer at all.
the what?
The term Persia, it's only
No,
Iran.
Iran. Yes,
Okay.
yes. But still, that idea of Iranianness that actually Reza Shah creates, it brings a political discussion to the floor rather than a sense of identity. Because you can do that with any society. You can talk about their identity through their name and language, but if you want to politicize it, it changes its tone a little bit. Then it becomes a point of disagreement, maybe for neighbors. It becomes a point of aggression if you wanted to do it that way. If you want to create that identity, say, just like Turkey and Greece, right? We are Turkish, you're Greek, so we don't want to get along, so we're not going to get along because simply one is more superior than the other, and it can work both ways. It's not just specific to one. In that case too, Iran has the same situation. Your point, though, that even Ferdowsi called Iran, it's a very good point. But I think that has more to do with the idea of identity and trying to keep the idea of Iran as an Iranian culture or a Persian culture that is very different from Arab culture. That's why the Ferdowsi, through tens of thousands of its couplets or its poetry, it does not use Arabic terminology, right? Which makes
Yeah,
it
actually, it's pure Farsi of that time, and I think until now, the people that they want to be authors or to go further on in the politics, they are consulted to study Ferdowsi and Shahnameh in order to learn very good Farsi, even today.
right. I mean, but at the same time too, I think 19th century was an amazing time for the Middle East because you have after the First World War and the American President Wilson's idea of self-determination, it gives the idea to all these nations that if you are an ethnic group of people or if you're a linguistic group of people, why couldn't you be politically represented yourself? You don't need to live under the control of another ethnic group of people. That might be fine on the surface, but over the long run, it's going to create problems, especially for uh, old societies, old civilizations like in the Middle East or in the Balkans that have always been diverse. There is no one over the other. This might be easier for, let's say, Scandinavia or for the Baltic region, right? But it cannot be so easy for the Middle East. It cannot be so easy for North Africa because these places or it cannot be definitely easy for India or for China even, because these people are old civilizations. You cannot separate them based on the identity that you want to create based on an ethnic group of people. It makes it very problematic.
But so it's I think it's a good point where you left it. I mean, we talk about Asian civilizations and we discuss about Iran. That is one of the oldest
Yeah.
civilizations, the ancient of civilizations on earth. I mean, as I told before, when we learn the Greek history, we learn about Iran, and it's getting very funny sometimes. Things at the schools because the kids they say once again it's about Iran, and it's getting funny about the kids as well. So it's the question that comes. We have a new state in Middle East. I mean, we have the Iranians, we have the Greeks. I mean, we had the Arabs, but from the other side, okay, we have the new states of the Arabs. We have the end of the Ottoman Empire, and we have Turkey. More or less, the Turks they were expected to be there, not in the territory that they acquired, but they got something longer from us.
Mhm.
So we have Israel that is coming in 48. So actually, Reza Shah didn't live with it, and he was not probably expected to have a new state. He left in 41. Mohammad Reza, he was very young, and he came along later on the 60s with the doctrine of periphery that Turkey and Iran they will support Israel as the Muslims but non-Arab states.
Right.
So, how this ancient, I don't take it from the political fact only, but also from the cultural fact that we see Iran, that it respects its borders, as you mentioned before. But we know that the borders of Iran, they are very respected by Iran. But from the other side, the influence of Iran starts from Beirut and ends in Kabul,
Mhm.
which means that people they celebrate Nowruz. I mean, they speak Farsi or Dari or any other dialects that they are very close. Most of the country, for example, Tajikistan, they learn their history from Shahnameh. People in Armenia, they respect the traditions and they enter Iran to go to their churches. So suddenly a new state appears from nowhere, and especially after the Islamic Revolution, the two countries they don't have any diplomatic relations. How culturally Iranians understand the existence and historically the existence of these new states?
Well, I think you pointed out the right way. Culturally, Iranians do understand because outside of Israel, state of Israel, in the Middle East, the only country that actually has a sizable Jewish population is Iran. A lot of people don't know that, despite the fact that Iran has been very anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-state of Israel since its conception. So a lot of people don't know that actually there are a lot of Iranian Jews that actually live in Iran. They're very happy to live in Iran. They do visit Israel. They go for pilgrimages and they come back, but they just don't want to live there because of whatever reason. So culturally, Iranians are not strangers to Jewish culture, so to speak. As I said, there are synagogues, there are various cultural
I've been there.
establishments.
I have seen
Right,
kosher restaurants.
right,
I've been to the hospital, to the Jewish hospital.
right,
So
right.
yeah,
So from that aspect, Iranians don't have a problem culturally that there is a Jewish culture somewhere. The problem arises from the fact that when it's politicized, remember what I said, cultures can exist, but once they are politicized, then it becomes problematic. With the concept of nationalism, of Jewish nationalism or Zionism that was created towards the end of 19th century, you do have the beginning of creating a political unit that is attached to a very rich and very contributory, very historical group of people called the Jews everywhere now around the world. Had there not been a Jewish state, then of course we wouldn't be talking about this right now. But because there's a Jewish state and because of its creation in a place that other people call home, meaning the Palestinians, then it becomes a political sort of a situation where people would use that to get their political message across. And I think for Iranians in general, if you are not part of the state, part of the regime, part of the Islamic Republic, they they have just as much respect for the Israelis as they might have for the Turks, as they might have for the Cypriots, as they might have for Egyptians. To them, it doesn't matter because they don't want war with anybody. Remember, Iranians have fought an 8-year war, and they don't like to repeat any part of that. And they were not, they didn't have the choice to do it. But when it comes to threatening Iran with bombings and vice versa, Iranians threatening Israelis with bombings, that everybody's going to take their own sides. And that's only natural. I've lived in Cyprus and I know how wonderful it is and how, the size of it, it's a small country, but at the same time, I remember when we would talk about Turks in any way, everybody's ears would get red and they would be very upset about the Turkish aggression. And that's a natural response, I think. It doesn't matter where it's happening. People love their states, people love their nations, although they are all made up and they're all invented in our own minds, because I think it's all regions. We have regional cultures, and then if you put a border around it, then you're just separating people. That's all. That's all you're doing. Imagine if the imaginary line between Turkish Cyprus and Greek Cyprus was removed. This would be all one culture. It would be different, and I couldn't say this one was superior than the other. But in general, borders create separations. Borders create enemies. Borders create something a lot more serious than meets the eye. But that story and that lesson is going to be a long time before people realize it. And I'm actually not really sure, now that I'm saying it, not really sure if people would buy that story, because people, it gives them a good, we say a fuzzy feeling inside their stomach to belong to a nation.
Matteo, I know that Iranians are not anti-Semitic because I've been there. I know how it works. I know how relaxed they are with different cultures. I saw it in Iran. I mean, I think Iran, they're having the biggest population of Afghan refugees. And even, I mean, by now, a lot of Iraqis, they go even to Iran to live and they
Right.
feel comfortable even despite the war between the two countries. Just we receive a lot of, I mean, 3 or 4 questions about that. Do you see any kind of anti-Semitism when it comes from the clerical leadership in Iran?
Similarities in what? I didn't get the question.
Anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism
Oh, anti-Semitism? No,
from
they're
the
not.
from the
Well,
clerical leadership.
I do teach the Israel-Palestine conflict. I haven't taught it for a while, but I used to teach it. And one thing that I always say is anti-Semitism has become part of the Jewish tradition, right? Because it's been happening for a long time, for over 2,000 years or even more. So there is anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism to be acted on, that's, I think, what we're talking about. Because Hitler was anti-Semitic too, and he decided for this final solution where tragically he killed 6 million Jews, right, in the Holocaust. So that's one kind of anti-Semitism. Another kind of anti-Semitism is to ignore a Jewish neighbor or not wanting to have to do anything to do with them because they're Jewish, right? That's another kind. So if people read the books that come out by Jewish authors that talk about Iran, they will see that before the revolution, none of this stuff actually was an issue. After the revolution, culturally, none of it was an issue, but it was brought to the fore because it was politicized. That's what I'm trying to get at. So the clerical establishment is not anti-Jewish, but the clerical establishment definitely has problems with the state of Israel because of its mistreatment of the Palestinians and the whole story that goes with the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it's nothing personal. It's nothing cultural. If anything, I think they think that it's really cool that Jews, exist in Iran, and if you ask Iranian Jews in the United States, we have them here in Chicago or in Los Angeles, which is by majority, they're very proud to be Iranian
Yeah,
Jews.
it's true.
They will
It's true.
not change that identity for anything. They're proud of Shahnameh, they're proud of Hafez, they're proud of everything that they've done. They have good relations with their Muslim Iranians. My own family works with a group of them in Los Angeles in various diamond and gold businesses. So there is no problem there. Culturally, the problems don't exist. What exists is problem the people that want to create problems out of political necessity, that they see that's the only way.
So, Matteo, what was wrong with the way that Mohammad Reza understood the clerical leadership and the reforms of the White Revolution in 1963 were not successful.
Well, where he went wrong was when he actually underestimated and miscalculated the power of the clerical establishment. And he also miscalculated the power that Ayatollah Khomeini had through his.
He had Matteo before. I mean, in the 60s, 70s, was an important figure in Iran.
Who, Khomeini?
Yes.
No, he wasn't. The people that were involved in the White Revolution, as you called it, in the 50s and 60s, they knew about him because he objected to it. Because Ayatollah Khomeini's family came from a landed background, so they lost a lot of land. So they lost money in that process.
Actually, and if I remember correct, also his father was assassinated by someone of the Qajar family.
Who was?
That, the father of Khomeini. He was assassinated when Khomeini was 5 or 6.
Right.
And I think he was assassinated by someone that was very close to the Qajar monarchy.
Well, it's possible. I have to check on that. It's possible. But going back to your question, I think underestimating, because the clerical establishment at that time, probably after the Tudeh party or the Communist Party that had the best network in town for the educated population, for the people that were receptive of ideas of socialism or communism in that regard. The great majority of the religious people that would go to the mosque or had some kind of contact with the mosque, that network of the clerical establishment with the mosque and the cassette tapes where Ayatollah Khomeini would, record his speeches, his sermons, and he would send them out to be distributed to the public. That part, I think Mohammad Reza Shah and his secret police, they underestimated. They thought that these people, because they look a different way, because they're not wearing a tie, let's say, or because they're not sympathetic to the West, they would not be powerful enough to take down a powerful monarchy. And at the same time, too, I think the Shah's sickness or illness has a lot to do with it also, because as we now know, he had cancer for some time and he was being given.
And United States, they knew about it.
Yes, yes, they did know about it, and apparently he was getting the wrong medicine, either intentionally or unintentionally. So that takes us to a whole realm of conspiracy and stuff that I don't want to get us bogged down in. But in essence, the short answer is underestimating the power of Islamic leadership in general, and that starts from the time of the Constitutional Revolution, because the seculars and the Western sympathizers just didn't want to deal with anything that had to do with Islam. And not that I'm saying that we all should or we all must. I'm saying that if we want to move forward for a better future, then they must be taken into account as well, and their wishes and their wants.
Matteo, that time that Mohammad Reza Shah, he had a good relationship with Israel. I mean, he did, because what we get, at least from the new evidence and the data that we have, is that Shah was not considering Israel as a friend. It's Israel that was looking for friends and was counting on Iran. So, and actually also, Reza Shah, he was sponsoring some Shia movements in Arabic countries in order to be, let's say, alert in the case that Iran was facing problems either with Arabs or Israelis. So what was actually the kind of recognition and help that Mohammad Reza was giving to Israel?
Well, the help, I think, the biggest help would be recognition of State of Israel as a Muslim nation. Iran was recognizing that, and that was a big deal. And at that time, Iran was a very powerful.
Was never recognized de jure. It was, let's say, the relationship was not really recognized by Shah.
Well, it was recognized because they did have cultural connections. They did have companies, Israeli companies, that would come to Iran and start the construction companies and in other fields too. And there are documentaries made about that. Where Israeli families actually coming to Iran and working. So I think the relationship was fine and safe. And what Israel wanted, as you label as Israel wanted to have friends. Yes, because Israel was an unwanted element within the Muslim society, within the Arab society. But Iran had a very difficult position, found itself in a difficult position simply because at that time it was part of the OPEC and it didn't want to upset the balance with the Saudis and others that were mostly Muslim nations that had created OPEC by majority, and they didn't want Israel to become a problem, so to speak. So Iran had a very fine line to walk, so to speak, as we say. And it did that successfully since we did have relationship with Israel. But at the same time, Israel really doesn't become a problem till later on, once various factions within the Islamic Republic bring about the idea of Palestinian injustice in the hands of the Zionists. And that connection is probably you find that in Lebanon, where Iranian
You mean with such?
fighters, Iranian militants were actually involved in the 1970s during the what do you call it, the Lebanese civil war and the participation of Iranians in it.
Mateo, we have two questions. I mean, it's so funny because we are receiving questions on what you say by our people, and it's very fascinating. And thank you very much, our friends that are watching, and they've been so interested in this show. So we choose from the questions because all the time they are sending and we're receiving on inbox, and it's amazing. Thank
So
you
what
very
are
much
the
for
questions?
that. So the last two questions that we pick up is it's about the current situation. It's how do you see, one of our friends asking, how do you see Iran responded to the Abraham Accords that countries of the Persian Gulf, they are part of it, like Bahrain and the Saudis. Does Iran feel a kind of threat, and how Iran may respond to the Abraham Accords, or how Iran understands the Abraham Accords?
From the perspective, from what I've read, I haven't talked to anybody in Iran since the Abraham Accords have happened, since I haven't been back there for some time because of COVID and other reasons. But from what I understand from the Iranian side is they think the Abraham Accord is an absolute joke. So they don't take it very seriously. However, they should take it seriously because people are moving on from that aspect. So if Iran doesn't want to fall behind, it has to get involved. And I'm sure there's some discussion on the foreign ministry level to do that. From the perspective of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, there is no argument that he does not only accept the Abraham Accord, he doesn't even recognize the state of Israel. So by not recognizing the state of Israel, there is no two parts to those agreements, right? Or to those accords. You're a lawyer, you know that better. So if one side is null and void and doesn't exist, then there is no agreement in essence. So that's why they think it's just a silly thing that the Arabs that are desperate are doing. That's how they're gonna basically frame it, right? And what was the second question? That was for the Abraham Accord.
So the second question, and it's the last question. We have friends that they're very interested in what's going on on the succession level of the current supreme leader. What's
Nobody
coming
knows.
next? What's coming
Nobody
next?
knows. I wish I knew.
So
If I knew, I would. If I knew, I would be in a very different position right now. I don't think anybody knows, to be honest with you. There are two possible things that can happen. One is that Iran is going to move to a council leadership, meaning there would be 3 or 5 ayatollahs from the council of experts or from other organizations that would essentially be voting on issues. So whereas Ayatollah Khamenei has the only absolute vote that can veto a lot of things, that will be transferred to 5 people. So it would be a 3-1 sort of a situation where things will get done. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that he has already, and Khobregan or the council of experts has already chosen somebody, and we just don't know who it is. That could be.
I support this opinion actually.
Okay. And the third one is that the Revolutionary Guards will move upon the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, will move to get rid of the position. So there would have to be a constitutional amendment made to, I think, Amendment 27, Article 27 of the Constitution, that will remove the position of supreme leader as the ultimate source of power, and hence the commander of the armed forces would be transferred to the state, whereas the Revolutionary Guard will be basically controlling everything and would putting their own
Just Matteo,
presidential candidates.
on this, the counter argument is that on the first scenario is that if we are going to have a kind of council or kind of many ayatollah deciding of many issues, then the idea of the deputy of Imam Mahdi is going to
Mhm.
disappear, because I think Imam Khomeini, he was the first one that he was named like this, and of course also many people they call it the current ayatollah also as Imam.
Mhm.
So this is the first counter argument, and the second one it's about the guardians. It's most of the people is like the case in the Iran-Iraq war, that they were very young. So the old people that were with the regime of the Shah, they've been removed. So the new people and the young people they took over the power, and that's why it was also very hard for them to be at the battle. So also now, because I mean, I discuss with people from Iran. I see people in our age. I am 38. I see people that now they have quite good positions in different foundations, institutions, even in the governments, in the parliament. There are people that they're about my age, and we don't feel them that they have the experience to understand what's going on, not only in the country but also regionally and globally.
Mhm.
And most of them, unfortunately, due to the sanctions, they didn't even have the chance to travel outside, or they get hard time. So how is possible a country to be left on the hands of people that actually they don't have the experience how to govern and how to rule such an important nation?
It's possible that it's happening, as you said, and it's real. It is happening. It's in the hands of people that don't know what they're doing because they don't have either the education or the experience or the savviness that is required on the global stage or on domestic stage for that matter. So it's happening simply because of nepotism and those people that actually put them there. These people have deep connections within the state, so that's why they get the positions that you and I might not be able to get, or somebody else that would be highly qualified inside Iran would not be able to get. And how that's demonstrated is the mess that Iran is in right now. Iran is under the influence of the Russians for the most part. It hasn't taken a side. It's mostly supporting the Russians in the Ukraine invasion, and that's not going to get them any friendship. And if Russia tries to push the idea of a written guarantee by the United States that it will not stop Russians and Iranians to deal, then it's going to lose the chance for JCPOA. That's what you get when you put diplomats in charge that, basically hand over the sovereignty of a nation to a superpower. And it would be, I was reading somewhere, because the motto of the Islamic Revolution was no West, neither
No,
West,
it's
neither West, only the Islamic Republic. And somebody was saying Iran should go back to that actually, and not side with anybody, because he can get a lot more done, and maybe he can get the JCPOA that it wants out of it. That means that it needs to get out of the control of the Chinese and the Russians at the same time. Is that possible? I have no idea. Are these people able to do it? Maybe not through conventional ways. Maybe they have to really have a heart-to-heart talk amongst themselves as to where they want Iran to go.
Uh, Matteo, on the last issue about the first scenario, that if we have a council of Ayatollah taking decisions about Iran, and about the idea of the deputy of Imam. So if we have this kind of council, can we consider that the idea and the doctrine of the deputy Imam is going to be removed as well?
Well, it depends how things go. The deputy position of clerics or ayatollahs that's not going to get destroyed. That's an institutionalized idea in Shiite, in political Shiite, and in Shiism as well. So that's not going to go anywhere. Shiism is not going to go anywhere. Islam is not going to go anywhere. Whatever is going to happen, for better or for worse, depending, whatever is going to happen, Islam is just going to get a little bit more realistic about how politics should be done. And I think that's the way to move forward, to not put everything in an Islamic context. I think that would be one thing that needs to be done. But and I think the Iranian population is ready for that, that the politics is not so much influenced by Islam, but they're not ready to get rid of Islam altogether as their religion. That's not going to happen.
Matteo, it's been a pleasure for tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I mean, we cover a lot, and from the Persian history and from the Iranian political context. I'm personally, it's been a pleasure for myself as a scholar of Iran to clarify a lot of things, and it's been very sufficient. And I like very much this conversation because also our friends they participated. It's been really an honor and a pleasure to have you from Illinois, and I think that in the future we're going to have a kind of try to create a kind of panel with professors that they are busy with Iran in order to exchange opinions, and not only about Iran, about the situation in the Middle East. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all of you that they've been participated today. We like it because we have received many questions and the audience was following up. And suddenly, Matteo, we have seen people that they know a lot about Iran, or people that they were very interested to know what's going to happen in the future in Iran. So probably being an Iranian has long way in the next years. Next Sunday, we're going to be together on the 13th of the month. We're going to continue the second part of our show with the journalist Michalis Mikhail, that we're going to discuss about the Cyprus history after 1955 until the Turkish invasion of 1974. The show is going to be in Greek, and further on, we're going to have more shows in English after Easter time with a lot of our friends participating. Wonderful. Matteo, have a nice afternoon in Illinois, and we're waiting for you soon to be in our show. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.